The Copacabana Club in New York was packed on the night of March 15, 1965. It was a Saturday evening, the kind of night that drew crowds from all over the city, people who'd saved up for weeks, sometimes months, to see Dean Martin perform live. The club was legendary, a place where you could feel the history in the walls, where generations of entertainers had graced the stage and left their mark on popular culture. The tables were full of businessmen in expensive suits, women in glamorous dresses, couples celebrating anniversaries, families celebrating special occasions. This was the New York that people dreamed about from the heartland. This was sophistication and class and the kind of entertainment that made you feel like you were part of something important. The Copacabana had a particular magic to it. The walls were decorated with murals of tropical scenes, palm trees and beaches that made you forget you were in the middle of Manhattan. The lighting was warm and amber, casting everything in a golden glow that made even the most ordinary people look like stars. The bar was polished mahogany, stocked with the finest liquors from around the world. The stage was intimate but grand, elevated enough that everyone could see, but close enough that you felt like you were in the room with the performers, not watching them from a distance. Dean Martin took the stage at 9 o'clock sharp, and the room erupted in applause that felt like it might bring the roof down. He had that effect on people. Even at 63 years old, with silver threading through his dark hair, with the lines of a lifetime of performances etched into his face, he commanded the stage with an ease that made it look like he wasn't performing at all. He was simply being himself, sharing his presence with an audience that would have paid double the price for the privilege. He wore a perfectly tailored tuxedo, the kind that probably cost more than most people made in a month. His cufflinks caught the light as he raised his hand to wave at the crowd. The orchestra struck up the opening notes of That's Amore, and Dean launched into the song with the kind of effortless charm that had made him a legend. Women leaned forward in their seats, their eyes locked on him, hanging on every word. Men laughed at his jokes before the punchlines arrived, anticipating his humor because they'd seen him perform before and knew what was coming. This was Dean Martin at his peak, not as young as he'd been in the 1950s, but somehow more magnetic for the age he'd become. There was something about seeing a performer who'd been doing this for 40 years and still brought that fire, that joy, that genuine connection to every single note. He wasn't just singing a song, he was sharing a moment with each person in the room, making them feel seen, making them feel like the song was written just for them. He moved across the stage with the fluidity of a dancer, even though he'd never been trained as one. It was natural grace, the kind that came from years of being comfortable in front of an audience. He pointed at women in the crowd, winked at them, made them blush. He did a little shoulder shimmy that made the men laugh. He was in complete command of the room, and he knew it, and the audience knew it. And there was a kind of intimacy in that knowledge that made the performance feel like a conversation rather than a show. In the third row, in a seat that had been purchased by his grandson 3 weeks earlier, sat a man named Robert Walsh. Robert was 87 years old, and this was perhaps his last chance to see Dean Martin perform live. He'd bought the tickets back in February when the reservation book had been opened by the club, and he'd counted down the days with an excitement that his family found both touching and slightly concerning. He'd been sick for the past 3 years, a combination of heart problems that his doctors had been careful to describe as serious without quite saying terminal. But Robert had held on, had fought through the fatigue and the pain, had refused to let his health stop him from doing the things that made him feel alive. Robert had always been a fighter. He'd come to America from Ireland at the age of 19, with nothing but the clothes on his back and a dream of building a life in a new country. He'd worked as a machinist in factories across New York for nearly 50 years, his hands bearing the scars and calluses of decades of labor. He'd raised a family, put 5 children through school, buried a wife, and now spent his time with his grandchildren, telling them stories about the old country, about the hardships he'd overcome, about the importance of working hard and treating people with respect. His wife, Margaret, had passed away 10 years earlier, and he'd been living with his youngest son's family ever since. They took good care of him, but Robert could see the worry in their faces every day. He could see it in the way they'd check his breathing when he was sleeping, the way they'd ask him how he was feeling multiple times a day, the way they'd exchanged looks with each other when they thought he wasn't paying attention. They loved him, but they were afraid of losing him. And Robert, being the kind of man who didn't want to be a burden, had started thinking about the things he wanted to do before his time ran out. One day, his grandson Michael, who was 24 years old and had never been afraid to push his grandfather into living a little, had asked him what he wanted more than anything. Robert had thought about it for a long moment, sitting in the chair by the window in his room, looking out at the streets of Queens where he'd spent so much of his life, and he'd said, "I want to see Dean Martin perform again, just one more time. To remember what it felt like to be alive, really alive, not just existing in this apartment waiting for the end." Michael had immediately gone to the phone and called the Copacabana Club. He'd booked the best table they had available, paid for it with money he'd saved from his job working at a bank, and he'd told his grandfather that they were going. No arguments, no backing out. Robert had protested, had said he was too tired, too sick, that he might embarrass himself by not being able to stay for the whole show. But Michael had been insistent in a way that reminded Robert of himself when he was young. That same stubborn determination that refused to accept defeat. So, on March 15, 1965, Michael had picked his grandfather up from the house, had helped him into the car, had driven him into Manhattan, had wheeled him into the Copacabana Club in a wheelchair, even though Robert had insisted he could walk. Michael knew better. Robert's health had declined significantly in the past few weeks. The doctors had started talking about heart failure, about how the old man's heart wasn't pumping blood efficiently enough, how his body was beginning to shut down, system by system. But here, Robert was dressed in his best suit, a suit he'd had since 1955, freshly pressed for this occasion, with a tie that Margaret had bought him years ago. His white hair was combed neatly. His hands, weathered and marked with age spots, were steady. He was here to see Dean Martin perform, and he was determined to enjoy every moment of it. Michael had positioned his grandfather at a table with a perfect view of the stage, close enough that Robert could see Dean's face clearly, close enough that he could almost feel the energy of the performance. The table was decorated with a white tablecloth and a small candle in the center. The waiter had brought water and cocktail menus. Michael had ordered a Coke for himself and a ginger ale for his grandfather, along with some appetizers. They sat in comfortable silence, waiting for the show to begin, father and grandson, each of them thinking about how precious this moment was, how it might be one of the last times they shared something like this. And now, as Dean Martin moved across the stage, singing with the kind of passion that suggested he'd never sung this song before in his life, Robert felt tears starting to form in his eyes. He was remembering 1952, 13 years ago, when he'd come to see Dean perform with his wife Margaret. They'd been young then. Margaret had been alive. They'd had their whole lives ahead of them. He'd held her hand during that performance, had looked at her beautiful face in the dim light of the nightclub, had felt like the luckiest man in the world to be married to her. And now, Margaret was gone. 13 years had passed. Their children had gotten older. Their grandchildren had been born. Time had done what time always does, which is to move forward, leaving everything else behind. Robert gripped the edge of the table and squeezed his eyes shut. He was not going to cry during Dean Martin's performance. He was not going to waste time on sadness when he could be celebrating the fact that he was here, alive, watching his favorite performer do what he did best. Dean was halfway through his third song when Robert felt it, a tightness in his chest, a fluttering in his heart that wasn't right. He'd felt this before. The warning signs his cardiologist had warned him about in grim detail just 3 days earlier. Robert's doctor, Feldman, had sat in his office and said things like stress on the heart, elevated strain. You need to be very careful about exertion. Robert had listened politely and then ignored most of the advice because Robert Walsh had never been good at sitting still and waiting for death. He'd always been a man of action, a man who did things, who lived life rather than merely endured it. But this tightness was different from the little flutters he'd been experiencing. This was a deep ache that radiated from his breastbone all the way through to his back. It felt like someone had wrapped a fist around his heart and was squeezing. Robert's breathing hitched. He tried to take a deeper breath, but it felt like his chest was too tight to expand properly. He gripped the edge of the table, trying to steady himself, trying to ignore it, trying to will it away through sheer force of personality. It was nothing, he told himself. Just anxiety. Just the stress of being in a public place. Something he hadn't done in months. Just excitement. His heart was responding to the thrill of seeing Dean Martin perform, to the emotional weight of being here with his grandson, to the knowledge that this might be one of his last chances to experience something like this. But the tightness didn't ease. If anything, it was getting worse. Robert felt sweat beginning to bead on his forehead. His hands, which had been steady all evening, were now shaking slightly. He clasped them together under the table, trying to hide it from Michael, trying not to worry his grandson who was sitting right next to him. Completely absorbed in the performance, completely unaware that his grandfather was beginning to experience what might be a serious medical emergency, Michael was grinning, occasionally glancing at his grandfather to see if he was enjoying the show. The young man had spent his savings on this evening, had used up a weekend off work, had done all of this to give his grandfather a gift. Robert could see how much this meant to his grandson, how happy he was to see his grandfather smiling, to see him at peace, to see him experiencing something beautiful. So Robert smiled back even as the pain in his chest intensified. He took another breath, this one more shallow than the last, because anything deeper made the pain worse. He was going to sit here and watch Dean Martin perform if it was the last thing he did. And given his health, that thought had more literal weight to it than it would have for most 87-year-old men. But the tightness wasn't easing. Robert's vision started to blur slightly around the edges. The lights of the club, which had seemed so warm and inviting when he'd first arrived, now seemed too bright, too intense. His hearing developed a strange quality, like he was underwater, like the sounds were reaching him from a great distance away. Dean's voice seemed to be coming from very far away, even though Robert could see him clearly on the stage, only 30 feet distant. Robert's heart was beating irregularly now, sometimes too fast, sometimes with strange pauses that made him feel like it had stopped entirely. His body was going into something like distress, though he couldn't quite bring himself to call for help. To call for help would be to admit that something was wrong, to admit that he might not be able to stay for the whole show, to disappoint Michael, who had done so much to make this night special. So Robert said nothing. He sat in his chair at his table in the third row of the Copacabana Club, and he died a little bit inside, knowing that his body was betraying him, knowing that he might not make it through the evening, knowing that sometimes the things we want most are the things our bodies won't let us have. Dean was singing Ain't That a Kick in the Head, one of his most famous songs, moving across the stage with the kind of fluid grace that suggested he'd been born moving. That movement was as natural to him as breathing. His voice soared through the room, carrying the melody, making it look effortless, making it sound like he was just a man who happened to be extraordinary. The audience was mesmerized. Dean had that gift, the rarest gift that any performer could possess, the ability to make you forget that you were watching someone perform. Instead, you felt like you were experiencing something genuine, something real, something that was happening just for you. Robert was struggling to focus on the performance now. His vision was closing in, like he was looking at the stage through a tunnel. The edges of his sight were going black, closing in like a curtain being drawn. His breathing was becoming more labored, more difficult, each breath requiring conscious effort, each breath producing less oxygen, making him feel more lightheaded, more dizzy. This was what dying felt like, he thought distantly, with a clarity that surprised him. This was what happened when an old man pushed himself too hard, when he tried to relive his glory days without the body to support it, when he tried to cram all of his remaining life into a single evening. His body was simply shutting down, the systems that had been deteriorating for years, now reaching the end of their ability to function. His heart couldn't keep up with the demand, his lungs couldn't deliver enough oxygen. His blood pressure was dropping, he was collapsing, falling, failing, and then, as suddenly as if someone had flipped a switch, Robert Walsh lost consciousness. One moment he was sitting at his table, gripping the edge, trying to breathe through the pain in his chest, trying to maintain consciousness, trying to stay present for this experience that he'd wanted so badly. The next moment, his body simply gave out, his muscles relaxed, his vision went completely black, his consciousness fled, leaving behind only a body that was no longer able to sustain itself. His head tipped forward, his arms fell limp at his sides. He slumped in his chair, and then, after a moment, he tipped sideways, his body beginning to slide off the chair toward the floor. Michael caught him, barely, his hands grabbing his grandfather around the shoulders and trying to hold him up, trying to understand what was happening. For a moment, everything was confusion. Robert's body was heavy, unresponsive. Michael couldn't tell if his grandfather was asleep or something else, something worse. He tried to position him back in the chair, but Robert's body kept going limp, kept sliding downward. "Grandpa," Michael said, his voice rising in pitch. "Grandpa, are you okay?" Robert didn't respond. He was completely unconscious, his face pale, his breathing shallow and irregular. Michael screamed. It was a sound of pure fear, pure desperation, pure terror at the realization that his grandfather was dying. Right here in the Copacabana Club, right in the middle of Dean Martin's performance, right when they were supposed to be having a magical evening together. Somebody help, somebody get a doctor. My grandfather, he's not breathing, he's not breathing. The scream cut through the noise of the club like a knife. For a moment, the audience didn't understand what was happening. This was a comedy show, a nightclub, a place for entertainment and fun. What was this interruption? What was this sound that didn't belong in this carefully curated environment of sophisticated entertainment? Then, people started to understand. The screaming teenager was holding an elderly man who was slumped over, unresponsive. Someone in the audience was in medical distress. Someone was dying right there in the middle of the show, in front of hundreds of witnesses, in the middle of one of the most famous nightclubs in New York City. A doctor who was seated a few tables over immediately stood up and moved toward the commotion. A woman near the bar started yelling for someone to call an ambulance. The band's music faltered, the instruments going quiet as the musicians realized something was wrong. Something real was happening, something that transcended the boundaries of entertainment. Dean Martin heard the commotion. He was in the middle of a lyric, his voice carrying to every corner of the room, his body moving with the choreography he'd perfected over decades. When he became aware that something was wrong, he saw Michael, saw the way the young man was holding his grandfather, saw the panic spreading through the crowd like a wave. He paused, just for an instant, his professional instincts warring with his human instincts. Most performers would have stopped immediately at this point, would have stepped back from the microphone and called for help, would have made sure someone got medical attention for the elderly gentleman who was clearly having some kind of serious medical emergency. The decent thing to do would have been to stop the show, to let the paramedics do their work, to turn off the lights and clear the room if necessary. But Dean Martin did something different, something that would shock everyone in the room, something that would become the moment that defined his character in a way that all the years of performances and jokes never could. He kept singing, his voice continued, clear and strong, even as chaos erupted in the audience. He didn't skip a beat. He didn't miss a note. He continued with the phrase he was in the middle of, his eyes tracking toward the commotion in the audience. But his voice never wavering, his performance never stopping, his focus never breaking. The orchestra, confused by what was happening, but trained to follow their lead performer, kept playing. The drums kept their rhythm, the piano kept its melody, the horns kept their harmony. The show continued as if an old man wasn't currently collapsed and dying 30 feet away from the stage. For 10 seconds, perhaps 15, maybe 20, the show kept going while the audience sat frozen, unsure of what they were witnessing. The cognitive dissonance was jarring. On stage, Dean Martin was singing about how good life was, about how a kiss is a kiss and a sigh is a sigh. In the audience, an elderly man was dying. A young man was screaming for help. A doctor was checking vital signs, looking grim. Waiters were running toward the scene. And yet, the orchestra played on and Dean Martin sang it was wrong. It was deeply wrong. It felt like a violation of something sacred, like watching someone ignore a person in need while continuing to party. The audience didn't know whether to look at the stage or at the dying man. Some people stood up, some people covered their faces, some people looked like they might get sick. And then, suddenly, Dean Martin stopped. He didn't finish the verse. He didn't complete the phrase he'd been working toward. He didn't build toward the crescendo, the way the song was supposed to go. He simply stopped singing mid-note, his voice cutting off abruptly, and he lowered the microphone. He took a step back from the edge of the stage, his eyes now fully focused on the scene in the audience, on the elderly man who was clearly in distress, on the young man who was screaming, on the doctor who was now checking Robert's pulse. For a moment, Dean just stood there, taking in the situation, understanding what he was looking at. Then something shifted in his expression. His face hardened with determination. His jaw clenched. He handed the microphone to one of the orchestra members without saying a word. And then he did something that no one in that room would ever forget. He jumped off the stage. He didn't use the stairs. He didn't ask for help from anyone. He didn't call for assistance or wait for someone to tell him what to do. He simply vaulted over the edge of the stage, his expensive tuxedo jacket not even a consideration, his multi-million-dollar career not even entering his mind. He jumped 6 feet through the air and landed hard on the floor below. his shoes scuffing the polished surface, his tuxedo tearing slightly as he hit the ground. For a moment after he landed, he stayed in a crouch, making sure he was stable, making sure he hadn't injured himself. Then he straightened up and ran toward the old man. His tuxedo jacket was forgotten on the stage. His microphone was left behind, still being held by one of the stunned orchestra members. His performance had vanished completely, replaced by something more important, something more real, something more human. The crowd parted as he moved through them. People who had been standing near the scene of the collapse scrambled to get out of his way, not because they recognized him as a star, but because his determination was so absolute, his purpose so clear, that anyone in his way would have been swept aside like a leaf in front of a hurricane. He knelt down beside Robert Walsh, where the paramedics had now arrived and were already beginning to work, where the grandson was still screaming his grandfather's name with a kind of raw desperation that only comes from watching someone you love dying in front of you. "What's his name?" Dean asked, his voice urgent and clear, cutting through the chaos and confusion like a command. "Robert, his name is Robert Walsh." Michael gasped, his hands shaking, his entire body trembling. "He's 87. He has a heart condition. Please, please do something. He's going to die. Please, Robert, can you hear me?" Dean said, looking at the old man's face. He placed his hand on Robert's shoulder, a gesture of connection, of presence, of bearing witness. "Robert, stay with me, okay? You're going to be fine. I'm here with you. Stay with me. Don't you dare leave me. You didn't come all the way down here to miss the rest of the show. You're not leaving me now. Stay with me, Robert." The paramedics were working now with the kind of focused efficiency that comes from years of emergency response training. They were pulling equipment from their bags, positioning their defibrillator, cutting through Robert's shirt to get access to his chest, checking his vital signs, assessing the situation. One of the paramedics, a man in his 50s with the weathered face of someone who'd been doing this job for a long time, looked at Dean, trying to figure out how to tell the most famous entertainer in the room to move out of the way without being rude, without causing a scene. But Dean wasn't in the way. He was kneeling beside Robert's head, looking into the old man's unseeing eyes, talking to him, keeping him company, refusing to let him die alone. There was something protective about his posture, something fierce about his determination to maintain some kind of connection with this stranger who was dying. "Can I help?" Dean asked the senior paramedic. "What do you need me to do? I can help. Just tell me what you need." The paramedic exchanged a look with his partner, some kind of nonverbal communication that they'd probably used in thousands of emergency situations. Then he said, "Just keep talking to him. Keep talking. If he can hear you, it might help keep him anchored. Keep talking and just be here." So Dean Martin knelt there on the floor of the Copacabana Club, in his expensive tuxedo, with his silver hair and his famous face that had sold millions of tickets and made women swoon and made men laugh. And he talked to a man he'd never met before, a man he had no reason to care about, no connection to, no obligation to, but a man who was dying, who was lying on a cold floor in a nightclub, who was rapidly losing his grip on life. And Dean refused to let him do it alone. "Robert, my name is Dean," he said, his voice steady and warm, the kind of voice that suggested he'd been here before, that he understood what Robert was going through, that he was not afraid of death or dying. "I'm going to stay right here with you. You're not alone, okay? You're not alone. You're surrounded by people who care about you. Your grandson is right here. The paramedics are taking good care of you. They're good at what they do. You're going to get through this. I can feel it. You didn't come all the way down here tonight just to miss the rest of my show. You're too stubborn for that. You're a fighter, Robert. I can see it in your face. I can see it in the way you're holding on. You're a fighter." The paramedics continued their work. One was attaching electrode pads to Robert's chest, cutting away the old man's shirt to make contact with his bare skin. Another was monitoring his vital signs, watching the monitor, which showed an erratic rhythm, a heart that was struggling, a heart that was failing. Robert's eyes flickered, just slightly, just a small movement that suggested that maybe, somewhere deep in his failing body, somewhere in the darkness of unconsciousness where his mind was drifting, he could hear the voice of the man talking to him. Maybe it was registering, maybe, in some way that they couldn't quite understand. Robert knew that he wasn't alone, that someone was there with him, that someone cared enough to kneel on a cold floor in a nightclub and talk to him while his life hung in the balance. "Come on, Robert," Dean whispered, his voice thick with emotion. "Come on, You can do this. Come on. Your grandson needs you. He loves you. I can see it in his face. He needs you to come back to him. Come on, Robert. Come on." The paramedics finished their setup. They positioned the defibrillator pads, confirming the rhythm on the monitor. The lead paramedic looked at his partner and said quietly, "Okay, charging." The machine charged with a high-pitched whining sound. The electricity built up stored in the capacitors, ready to deliver a shock to Robert's failing heart. "Everybody clear," the paramedic said, and everyone who wasn't actively working on Robert moved away from him. Everyone except Dean. Dean stayed right where he was, his hand on Robert's shoulder, his face close to the old man's face, his voice continuing to speak directly to him, as if they were the only two people in the room. "Come on, Robert," Dean said. "I need you to come back to me. I need you to fight. I know you're strong enough. I know you can do this." The paramedic pressed the button on the defibrillator. The electrical shock delivered to Robert's chest, making his body convulse violently, his back arching off the ground, his arms twitching with the force of the electricity running through his system. It was violent and terrifying and necessary. The last resort of medical science. When the heart stops working, Robert's body went rigid for a moment, then went slack. The monitor continued its chaotic rhythm. "Come on, Robert," Dean whispered. "Come on, you can do this. Come on." The paramedics charged the defibrillator again, prepared to deliver another shock. For long, agonizing seconds, nothing happened. The monitor kept its flat line, then irregular squiggles. The visual representation of a heart in distress, a heart that was failing, a heart that might not make it back. Robert's body remained limp, his chest not rising or falling, his color becoming ashen, his life ebbing away with every passing second. The grandson was crying, his hands over his mouth, making small whimpering sounds, watching his grandfather's body being shocked over and over again, helpless to do anything but bear witness. And Dean kept talking. He kept his hand on Robert's shoulder. He kept speaking directly to this dying man, as if the force of his will, the power of his words, could somehow keep Robert tethered to life, could somehow convince this old man's body to keep fighting. "Robert," Dean said, and his voice was breaking now, emotion overwhelming his carefully maintained composure. "Robert, please, please, come back, please. There are people who love you. Your grandson loves you. I'm here with you. Please don't leave. Please come back. Robert, please." And then, suddenly, like a miracle, the monitor beeped once, twice, a third time, and then it showed a rhythm, a heartbeat. Robert's heart had started beating again. Not strongly, not steadily, but beating. His heart was functioning again. "We've got a pulse," the paramedic said, his voice steady and professional, despite the relief evident in his eyes, despite the way his shoulders relaxed slightly. "We've got him back. We need to get him to the hospital now. We need to move." Paramedics rushed in and stabilized Robert Walsh, loading him onto a stretcher and rushing him to the hospital while his grandson Michael refused to leave his side. Dean watched as Robert was taken away, alive but fragile, and made a promise to an unconscious stranger that they would meet again and finish the show properly. Back inside the Copacabana, the club was frozen in shock. The illusion of entertainment had shattered, replaced by the raw reality of life and death. Dean climbed back onto the stage, visibly shaken, and spoke honestly to the audience. He admitted his initial hesitation, confessed his shame for continuing the performance for a moment, and explained that saving a life mattered more than any show. He dedicated the rest of the night's performance to Robert, celebrating the fact that his heart was still beating. The audience responded not with applause for entertainment, but with respect for a man who had made the right choice. When Dean returned to the stage after a short break, the performance carried a new depth and emotional weight. Every song was filled with purpose, especially That's Amor, which became a tribute to survival rather than spectacle. Robert survived. Dean followed through on his promise, calling the hospital daily, sending flowers and handwritten notes, and staying connected throughout Robert's recovery. Weeks later, he arranged for Robert and Michael to return to the Copacabana as honored guests. During the show, Dean publicly dedicated a song to Robert, brought him on stage, and told the audience that Robert hadn't just been saved, he had taught Dean what truly mattered. After the performance, Dean joined Robert and Michael for a private dinner, choosing connection over celebrity. As they talked late into the night, Robert reflected on how close he had come to death and how Dean's decision to leave the stage had changed everything. That night became more than a medical emergency, it became a defining moment of humanity. proving that compassion and presence can matter more than fame, success, or the show itself. Dean listened quietly as Robert explained what that night had meant to him. Robert told him that leaving the stage to stay by his side had shown him something he had never felt before, that his life mattered. Not as a fan, not as an audience member, but as a human being. Dean responded simply, saying he had only done what anyone should do when they see someone in need. That moment became the foundation of a deep friendship. Over the next 7 years, Dean Martin and Robert Walsh stayed close, speaking often and seeing each other whenever Dean was in New York. Despite his growing fame and busy career, Dean always made time for Robert, reminding him through words and actions that he mattered. When Robert's health declined and he passed away in 1972, Dean immediately returned from Las Vegas to attend the funeral. Standing before Robert's family, Dean told the story of the night at the Copacabana, how he had chosen to leave the stage, how that choice had changed his life, and how Robert had taught him that the most important moments aren't performances, but acts of humanity. Dean spoke openly about what he learned, that sometimes doing the right thing means ruining your plans, and that the greatest acts of courage happen offstage. His words left the church in silence, filled with understanding. The story of that night spread and became part of Dean Martin's legacy, not because of his talent, but because of his character. He was remembered not for the songs he didn't finish, but for the life he helped save. It became a lasting reminder that true greatness isn't found in applause, but in choosing compassion when it matters most.